Hello, everyone. We've got a number of people joining, which is fantastic. Everyone's already had their morning coffee and sitting down ready for their lunch break in an hour or two. If you'd like to, feel free to use the chat function to share who you are, where you're working from today, potentially what organisation you work for. Keep this as interactive as possible throughout the next hour.
Yeah, I love this moment when everyone's joining, just seeing where everybody's coming from and logging in from today.
You from Sydney, a few Kiwis on the call, welcome. Some up in Brizzy. I think we're having some Brisbane-like weather here today in Sydney.
Yeah, it's quite sunny here in Melbourne today as well, actually. It's nice.
Fantastic. All right, perfect. Well, we've got a number of people on the call on the webinar today, so I think we might get started if that's all right with you, Leanne.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining. First off, I'd like to open today's session by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm speaking to you from today. I also acknowledge the lands on which each of you are living, learning and working from, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples online with us here today. This day, although it's next week, for us Unminders, it's a global initiative that we know began in Australia, and it holds really profound significance as we come together to raise awareness around mental health, break down the stigma surrounding it, and most importantly, ask a simple yet very, very powerful question: are you okay? So we have a fantastic group of people here who've joined us today for the webinar, all whom I imagine are bound by a collective mission, and that is to create a world where every individual knows that they're valued, that they're heard, and they're not alone in their struggles. If you haven't met me before or seen me before, my name is Claudia Graves and I'm an account executive here at Unmind. I'm also a crisis supporter volunteer at Lifeline. I'm often the first point of contact for any new business in the APAC region, looking to partner with Unmind from a strategic and proactive wellbeing point of view. I am absolutely delighted to have the fantastic Dr Leanne Harper online with me today to lead the session and provide her clinical and practical expertise with all of us on the topic for this year's Are You OK Day. Leanne is a UK-trained chartered clinical psychologist and registered to practice psychology in the UK and in Australia. She has over 10 years experience in the NHS and private practice, working with people with mental health difficulties and their families. Leanne has worked in community mental health teams, early intervention for psychosis teams, female prison services, and in liaison psychiatry, where she offered in the moment psychological support to people in mental health crisis. She's worked with people from teenagers to older adults and is trained in multiple psychological assessments and interventions. You need to take a bit of a breath. I think there's a lot here, Leanne. And a lot of Leanne's work has included training and consultation in mental health, and this has included training emergency workers to understand mental health difficulties, both in themselves and the people that they work with. She now runs workshops and webinars across Australia and internationally to share mental health tips and support to anyone who wants to learn. She is passionate about sharing mental health awareness, support, strategies, and understanding of how we can have difficult conversations. Leanne has also multiple published research papers into mindfulness, post-traumatic stress, and the benefits of mental health education in an inclusive setting. She is passionate about sharing information in an inclusive way, as mental health rarely just affects one person. Her approach to training is informal, informative, and digestible, and will often involve techniques that you can use for yourself and with other people. So before I hand it over to fantastic Leanne, we have a bit of brief housekeeping. So here at Unmind, we absolutely love interactive sessions here. So we do encourage you, as a number of you have already done, to introduce yourself, use the chat function throughout today's session. But for any questions that you'd like answered by myself or by Leanne or the team, please post in the Q&A box. And we'll answer these as best as we can throughout the session, and then also hopefully have some time at the end to answer them as well. Over to you, Leanne, just for a little bit more housekeeping.
Yes, thank you for that. It's a really long introduction. Yes, hi everybody. Just for a little bit more housekeeping as well. I think it's really important to mention when we talk about mental health, we are talking about all levels of mental health as well. And in doing that, I would be doing a disservice in this talk today if we didn't talk about all of the difficulties of mental health and when things can get really, really hard, and when things can get really tough, basically, when things get really bad. This isn't always common, but it happens. So I do want to mention that there might be times when I mention some traumatic things that can happen, or talk about the realities of how mental health can affect us, and also times when I might mention suicide or suicidal thoughts. So I just wanted to say, I will try and provide a trigger warning when that happens. I know that a lot of people on this call would have been affected by that in some way. So please look after yourself. Do whatever you need to do. If it gets too hard right now for you to listen to, that's okay. Turn it off. You're welcome to leave. You're welcome to put us on mute for a little bit. Just take some time, whatever you need. I think a lot of people don't or feel a little bit nervous about talking about mental health because of the worry about what the conversation that could lead on to. So I'd be doing a disservice if I wasn't going to acknowledge that and acknowledge that within the conversation so that we can have the conversation. But in doing that as well, it's also really important that people are logging onto this webinar from so many different places. And what's important is your well-being. And I completely trust that you can manage that on this webinar, and do what you need to do. If you don't feel like you want to listen to a bit, that's completely okay. Just please look after yourself as well. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that before we get into it. But I will try and provide warnings if we're going to get into touch on more difficult stuff before we do.
Amazing. Thank you, Leanne. So to jump into the discussion today, it's a really exciting topic for this year's Are You OK Day, and we've tried to make it as practical and as utilising a really strong evidence base to provide all of you on the call today with tools, advice, supports to get you on your way in the lead up to Are You OK Day next week. Where we want to begin is, you know, the notion of prevention. And from the earliest days of Unmind, we've held the really strong belief that prevention is better than cure, and we still do. So Leanne, what are some of the strategies that you would suggest to support mental health in the workplace of those online today?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think often when we talk about preventative strategies in terms of mental health, we'll often we think straight ahead to that supportive workplace environment and having these conversations. But often when I talk about mental health, I sort of go back to all of the needs that we have. And I often refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of our mental well-being as well. And I just think it's really important, especially within a workplace environment, that when we're thinking about supporting somebody's mental health, there's still a triangle of needs. So in supporting well-being, that's also supporting the bottom part of that triangle, which is those physiological needs. So in terms of the workplace, but in terms of physiological needs as well, that food, water, and warmth. So is it a workplace where people are taking their breaks? Are you expected to have time whilst you're working to take your breaks and eat your food? If you're working in an environment where you're working 12, 14-hour days with no food, that's going to affect your mental health. So really thinking about that physiological well-being, taking lunch breaks. What's the weather like? What's the temperature like? If you're working in a really hot environment and it's just hot, there's nothing you can do about that. Do you have more breaks to account for that? and how is your physical health in that situation as well, because to have good mental health, we rely on that physical stuff too. And there's also the next level in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so like safety, and that comes with obvious things like bullying and harassment. Obviously, we want to be in environments where that is as minimal, obviously aiming for zero. But also that physical safety. I remember a couple of years back, there was a big initiative when I was working in the UK in terms of nurses in hospitals and having to finish work and then walk to their car in a dark car park at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and just that physical safety after work. So really looking at the physical safety of the workplace, and if there's extra things that people need to do that's going to increase a little bit of anxiety and worry that doesn't have to be done. So it's, I think, with terms of when you're looking at mental health, also check out that physiological safety, check out the safety, and then you can go up the hierarchy of needs in terms of belonging, so relationships, friendships, having a purpose at work, making sure everybody's included, and then go into feelings of accomplishment. And again, in the workplace, it's knowing why you're doing what you're doing can be so beneficial for your mental health and well-being, especially at work. There's quite a lot of research that suggests that if people understand the why a little bit more at work, then you just have such a better feeling of that accomplishment and self-esteem, and that you're contributing to the workplace as well. And that's when you can get up to the top, the self-actualization in terms of fulfilling one's potential and that good mental well-being. But in terms of preventative strategies, looking at the whole person and the whole situation, which includes that physiological health as well, it's just such an important place to start that we often don't always think about when we think about mental health. I think in terms of the workplace safety as well, it's also acknowledging that life happens. So the first thing you can do in a workplace is try and not contribute to somebody's mental health via work, is in the stress of the workload and things like that. But also acknowledging that sometimes life happens outside of work. So allowing those flexible hours so people can attend appointments or support people with caring responsibilities, or just acknowledge that life happens sometimes, and trying to create that environment where it's okay that life happens, and supporting people around that to reduce the additional layer of stress.
That's a really good point, and developing that culture where it's normal to ask for help, and when life happens, there's that safety net to know that you can ask for that help. And I think that ties in really nicely with just the workplace culture that's being developed. So, it's the starting place for any sort of mental health strategy or anything, is that we need to have a workplace where and a supportive culture, and that's ideally where everyone wants to get to. And I've heard this analogy time and time again where, you have really thriving, it's a fishbowl analogy actually, where you have really thriving fish and you put them into a dirty fishbowl, and you can't expect them to thrive, a toxic environment. So, we want to create that culture where it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to demonstrate those help-seeking behaviours. And I think what would be great to know, Leanne, is what are some best practices for creating this culture where people do feel safe to ask for help if they do need it?
That's such an important question and such a brilliant point. And I could talk forever on workplace culture. So just trying to be mindful of how to succinctly answer that without talking about that for the full hour. But I completely agree. Workplace culture is the idea of how do you create an environment where it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say things aren't great right now. And it's really normal that people support other people within a workplace setting as well, which can just really make things so much easier. But the thing about culture is that it's not like a strategy. It's not like a one initiative that just happens every day. Workplace culture is really those entrenched beliefs in terms of the collective beliefs and behaviours and thoughts and attitudes across the workplace. I think the best way to describe a workplace culture is the way we do things around here. The way that everybody naturally does things, is it's that done thing. Sometimes you can read a lot about a workplace, but as soon as you go into the room, you sort of get an idea of the culture and how things are done. So how to create that culture that is supportive of people's mental health, it's supportive of having difficult conversations, and it's a supportive place, basically. It's absolutely a collective approach, and it comes from everybody. Everybody has to contribute to it. There's a lot of research into positive organisational culture and the benefits of such. However, whilst there's a lot of talk about it, it can be difficult to achieve in practice and even more difficult to demonstrate. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. What a positive workplace culture looks like in one place might be completely different to another place, depending on where you're working and what you're doing and what supportive looks like to you. Some workplaces need a little bit more humour because it's the type of work where some workplaces need that more supportive, like nurturing response. And that's very dependable on what you're doing. So in terms of creating that positive culture, it takes time. There's not one clear strategy. It's a group effort and it's always collaboratively developed. So it's lots of conversations with people in your team. It depends on how big the organisational culture is. The bigger the organisational culture, the more like subcultures you'll probably have within the teams within that as well. So it's really working with the direct team that you're working with, and then other teams as well, to think about how you feel supported at work and what you do to feel valued. I'm sure there's loads of people that are on this chat, and I'd love to hear your suggestions of like what a supportive culture looks like for you, and what that looks like in the workplace for you, because it can be so different. I'd love to hear different examples of a positive workplace, because it's acknowledging those personal differences, acknowledging sorry, my brain, but acknowledging that everybody's different.
Yeah. So anyone who's active in the chat, feel free to pop in. You know, what does a supportive culture look like for you personally, or what does it look like for you today, you know, in your team environment? And if you are open to sharing a little bit about what that looks like, might be characteristics of it, rituals that you have, anything of value, we'd love to see it.
So yeah, there's some things coming through now. So it's okay to make mistakes. I think that's a really big one in creating an environment where it's okay to make mistakes as well. It needs to be quite a joint approach from everybody in the team. Feeling safe to speak up. There's so many brilliant things coming through now in the chat. That I can't read them fast enough.
A lot about flexibility, so suiting needs of people at different life stages. So it might be looking after kids, might be going to doctor's appointments, carers duties, etc. So yeah, having that flexibility arrangement sort of baked into the culture. Empathy for others. We have each other's backs. I really like that one. Checking in on colleagues and just general respect for everyone. So thank you all for sharing those in the chat. We'll keep an eye on them as we push on. But I think, sorry, Leanne, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say it's so great to see some coming through, and it's really like a theme underneath this. It's like acknowledging the humanness in a workplace environment, that we make mistakes, we're not perfect, and how to have those, like, just checking in with each other. And I think creating a workplace culture where we do that is really, really important, and that is how we treat each other in the workplace. It's how it's everybody's responsibility, I think. I really like the phrase. I once heard that people often talk about traffic, and people often say, I'm stuck in traffic. And then somebody once sort of said, when you feel like you're stuck in traffic, you feel like you blame the traffic, but actually you are the traffic. You are also the car, you are part of it. And that's the same with that culture and organisation as well. It's how do you then start to be vulnerable and start to ask the questions and start to create the culture that you want to be in with the team, and then other people will often, it's like a ripple effect, often copy that. But that takes a lot of bravery and a lot of courage. But the more people you find you can do that with, the more you can start to create that supportive culture that you want to be in. And there's so wonderful examples of this coming through now in the chat.
Fantastic. That's a great analogy, Leanne. And that ties in really nicely into just like changing that culture. And that's often people looking at the future state, and that's sort of the desired future state for many organizations, is they have that that North Star where they want to get to. But we know it takes a lot of hands, it takes a lot of time and dedication to get there. But one thing we do know, and what the data tells us time and time again, is that leaders need to be part of the change, and they really need to lead the change from the top. So how can we support leaders to promote positive workplace cultures? Do you have any ideas around that, Leanne?
I think it's very similar to what I was saying before about being part of that change. I think especially with leaders, there's a really big difference between a leader that says, I want everybody to take their lunch breaks and I want everybody to finish work at 5:30 and not take work home with them, who then works a 16-hour day and doesn't take their lunch breaks and take work home with them, because people often mirror what they see. So I think it takes, this is like the really uncomfortable advice, but it takes that hard work, because we have to be the culture that we want around us. And that involves, if we want to be in a culture that everybody looks after their mental health, then we also have to look after our own mental health. And we have to prioritize our work time so that people can see us taking breaks, so then they're more likely to do it. I've definitely, when I've worked in different environments in the past, I've had a manager who at 12 o'clock, everything shut, we all went for lunch, which I know is not always realistic, but was one of the best places I've worked, in that you just knew you had that half an hour where everybody went and came back again. And then I was so much more productive in the afternoons when I worked that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think really acknowledging that as part of that, being the change of being in that culture as it comes from you as well, and mirroring that way. I often talk about Brené Brown and the wonderful work that she does in terms of that vulnerability in leadership, and that's Daring to Lead program that she has. If you haven't heard of Brené Brown, she has some wonderful TED Talks. I really recommend her work on how the leadership can create that vulnerability and create that culture within that practice as well.
And a lot of it comes down to that, just role modeling good behaviours. So taking those lunch breaks if you can. And of course, there's going to be days when it's near impossible, and it's okay to acknowledge that, and it's okay for teams to see that, but to not make it a recurring theme that no lunch breaks taken, or work out of hours is expected. That's reversing some of the good work that a lot of people probably on the call today are actively doing in their own organizations. But it's also important to note that we've come a long way, and in terms of mental health in the workplace, and it's finally getting the attention it deserves and needs. So we do know, though, that in order to get wellbeing programs off the ground, we need investment and buy-in from our senior leaders. And a large component on that is talking about the financials and what the clear benefits are of culture change. But I guess, do you have any tips or advice, Leanne, on how to best engage with the leadership team on the non-financial benefits of culture change? What does that sort of look like?
I think that is a great question, because I think there's always a financial benefit to culture change. I think there are definitely non-financial benefits that support, but the non-financial benefits ultimately then also benefit financially. There is so much research and so much evidence to suggest that when people are in organizations that effectively embed wellbeing and support as part of their culture, there's some research from the Oxford University Press that says people are 20 times more likely to exceed financial targets when they're in a workplace with positive mental health and wellbeing support. 20 times more likely to exceed financial target. 10 times likely to have the same off, 12% increase in productivity. There is, if people are feeling, if people's mental health is supported, then people are enjoying their workplace and are happy to go to work, then people work harder, and people are more engaged, and people are more likely to be creative. If it's okay to make mistakes, then people are probably definitely more likely to be creative in the workplace, which will then ultimately have financial benefits. So whilst the investment is upfront, I have not yet read research that suggests that supporting people's mental health has a financial detriment in the long term. Like there is a financial benefit.
Yeah, too right. And I think moving the conversation along, Leanne, into specifically around the Are You OK Day, and how we can bring these cultures and this supportive language into actually ultimately having a conversation. it's talking about, you know, having that safe space to have a difficult conversation, and that notion of active listening. And that is really, really listening with intent, and intent to listen and hear someone out. We had some interest before the webinar just to understand how you can provide a space that always fosters the question, are you okay day, and not just around the day. So the one day in the year that we celebrate Are You Okay Day, how can we create that ongoing narrative at the business so that Are You Okay Day is ultimately, and hopefully in future, every single day of the year? What are your thoughts on that, Leanne?
I think having that, asking how are you and asking twice. It was always, there's such a natural response for, hey, how are you? And you go, yeah, I'm good, thanks, you. It like rolls off the tongue before you've thought. So asking twice, like, oh, but how are you? So that people stop and think about it a little bit. I think in a workplace environment, how to have conversations about how to support people's mental health and well-being. I am a big believer in having a conversation before the conversation is needed. So I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but when we are struggling with our mental health and things feel really hard, that's probably the hardest time for us to talk about our mental health, because mental health is so attached to shame and embarrassment, and there's a lot of cultural pressure on it still, even today. And I think we've come a long way forward compared to when I first started working in mental health, but it's still really hard to have those conversations. The hardest time to ask for support is probably when we need it the most, and that's probably when we also struggle the most. So in terms of creating a culture and creating an environment where we can have these conversations, is prepping for these conversations before they're needed. That can be as part of an intake, as part of when you're welcoming people to the team, or it can also be a check-in. It can be I went to a webinar this week and we had a conversation about how to support someone's mental health. So I'm now checking in with all my team members and having a chat. And that's asking questions such as, is there anything we can do that supports your well-being? Asking them in that proactive, preventative kind of way, what can we do as a workplace that's going to support your well-being whilst at work and then overall? And it's also asking questions like, how would I know if there's something wrong? How would I know as your manager that you're not okay? What are your signs? Because saying I'm not okay it's really hard to do. I think I mentioned last time I did a webinar, it takes people on average 7 years to seek support when they're struggling. And that is absolutely 7 years way too long. So if you can have a conversation from the start in terms of what would I notice when you're struggling? Because when you ask that question with people, you get really interesting responses. Sometimes people, well, first of all, then people feel it's really heard, because then people have to think. If somebody says to you, how do I know you're not okay? You then have to think about what happens when I'm not okay? And it starts that thinking of yourself. It makes people feel listened to, like somebody genuinely does want to care and want to acknowledge. And it can also have interesting questions. I am always so interested with people's responses to this, because sometimes it's, when I'm not okay, actually my makeup's really, really good. And I start dressing so well, which often unless you'd have that conversation, if somebody came in and was all of a sudden looking amazing, you'd be like, oh, they're having a great time. Like they look really good. Whereas you've had this conversation beforehand, it then makes the conversation easier for them to say, oh, do you remember when we had that chat last year and I asked how I'd know you're okay? And you said you'd put more makeup on and start looking well. You've looked great this year. You've looked great this week. Is everything okay? And it really starts to open up that conversation, and sort of given that it basically, when you're asking somebody how I know is there something wrong, you're sort of given that permission to then ask a question when something is wrong. Because how many times have we, as human beings, as employees, as friends, as family members, been worried about somebody, but also not sure how to ask, or not sure how to say, I'm really worried about you, because we don't want to offend people, and we have this instant worry it might make things worse. Whereas all of the evidence that I've ever read has suggested that what people want when they're struggling is someone to notice and to someone to ask if they're okay. But what we worry about when we look like somebody struggling is we don't want to offend them by asking them. So we get caught in this difficult conversation where therefore we don't ask, and therefore people are struggling on their own. So by having this conversation in advance in terms of how would I know there's something wrong? and a follow-up of what would you want me to do and how would you want me to broach it means you've started that conversation before it's needed, and you've therefore got that permission to do it if you then worry about them in 5, 10, 20 months in the future. You've already started the conversation, you've already got that permission to broach it, which can then make the conversation just feel so much less intimidating at the time when you don't know what to do, because often we don't do it because we don't know how to. When you've had the conversation in advance, you already know how to. It takes away that level of difficulty with it. So I think sitting down with people as part of your check-ins, as part of your conversation, as part of welcoming to the team, of saying, how would I know there's something wrong? Because it's so different for some people. For some people, it is sort of what we expect in mental health in terms of being withdrawn and being quieter. With some people, it's I suddenly will become the life of the party, or I put more makeup on. I put more effort to look better because it's more of a mask that I have to put on to go to the outer world. That's really normal. A lot of us look better when we're doing worse. So really checking in with people and knowing what you're looking out for, and having the conversation with them of how they'd want you to broach it means you then just feel more confident in broaching it in the future. So I think having that preventative conversation first, and also just make someone feel heard. It's so rare that we get asked in conversation, what happens and how do you want me to respond when this happens? But I think that's such a wonderful conversation that we can have, and whenever people ask me questions like that, I just feel really valued, because it's somebody really taking their time to get to know me on that level. And yeah, so asking, how would I know? What do you want me to do? How do you want me to broach it? How do we know when things go really wrong? How do we know that things are really bad? Who do you want me to call? Like who's around? Who would be a best person with it? If I'm really worried about you, who would you want me to call? Because at the time, we'd say no one. But in the future, we'd probably have people in mind that would help us. And also, is there anything I absolutely shouldn't do? I think knowing in advance how to help and what to do and also what not to do. My example of that is always like, some people are huggers, some people want to hug. Some people absolutely not huggers. You do not want to do that. Some people, I know that how I want to be supported in a workplace is very different to how I'd want to be supported at home. So in a workplace with colleagues, I want you to make an inappropriate joke so that we all laugh, and then I can have a conversation about it afterwards. I don't want you to come and hug me because I don't want to cry in the workplace. I want to have a joke, and then I want to diffuse the situation so that I can talk around it a little bit easier in the workplace. That's probably different to what I'd have at home. So I think having a what should I do, what shouldn't I do conversation before it happens means that you're just aware. And then there's nothing as a manager, as part of your notes, your record keeping you have on people, to write that down and just look back on it every month, every check, not every month, but however often you check in, however often you check in with people in terms of their workload, have that for you in terms of mentally checking as well, what signs that they'd say. And I think if someone's really struggling and somebody comes up and says, I remember 18 months ago, you said that you'd wear less colour and I've noticed you've been in grey all week, is everything okay? Or any sort of example like that. Just what people want when they're really struggling is to feel heard and feel seen. And I think holding somebody's in mind and then going back and asking them is just so helpful in terms of them feeling heard and seen.
It's that permission and that proactive permission piece, gathering the information that you need if you need it in future. And I think this ties in really nicely with the hybrid work environment. We don't have those water cooler moments where you can turn to someone and say, hey, how are you today? Or how are you going? So how can we do that? Or do you have any tips or advice on how to build a supportive culture virtually? So how to spot signs when someone may be struggling, but you can't get that body language or that face-to-face connection that you would normally say in the kitchen or in the office.
I think that's so important. And I really think there's people on this call that have such good practices that you're doing. So if anybody works remotely, who's on this chat now and has things that you do as part of your workplace where you support people virtually, please pop it in the chat so that we can all learn from each other. I think that virtual way of working is still relatively new compared to general corporate environments. and we can all still learn from each other. For me personally, I think it goes back to having that conversation beforehand and how important it is, especially if it's all virtual, in terms of how would I know virtually if things aren't okay, or how do we check in? I think it just means we need to be even more proactive in terms of how to offer that support, or how people would speak to you. So if it's that you have something in your workplace of, okay, if you're struggling, then just send me a message with have like a copy and paste that you send to somebody, or have like a way between yourselves that says, I'm struggling. It could be that you send a certain emoji in the Teams chat, which means I just need a little bit more care today. And that sort of little cues that you can plan together as a team in terms of how to ask for that support, or how to say things aren't okay right now. Yeah, I think a lot of people are saying more regular one-to-ones, more regular catch-ups with people, and just that time within work meetings as well. So have that 5 or 10 minutes before a meeting, or after a meeting, but that really protected space to check in and be like, how's it going? And having that human conversation rather than are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. Okay, bye. It's having a chat of, what are you doing at the weekend? How are things? Having that personal conversation, so then if things do get harder, you've already got that space where you're having those chats. I think
Sorry,
a lot
I was
of the
going to jump in and just say, I think that's so important. I think, and I know here at Unmind, we consciously have that through an employee experience tool where we'll check in, and the first thing you check in with is, how are you feeling about work? How are you feeling personally? How's your wellbeing going? And then we jump into the business as usual. But it's important that we tick that off before we go into any sort of more regimented one-on-one topics or agenda items. So yeah, that's fantastic. I think in terms of the virtual and in-person working environment, what are some of the signs that we can familiarize ourselves with that could potentially suggest that someone might be struggling? So what are some of the things that we can look at? And there definitely will be some overlap between, you know, in-person and virtual, but perhaps there's some others that we could have in our toolkit.
Yeah, and I think the main signs that we're seeing is signs that things are different to how they usually are. So the better we know people in the work environment, the more we'll know if things seem different. In terms of mental health, some early warning signs that we often talk about is that becoming more socially withdrawn. So maybe not talking as much as somebody would have, or not engaging as much in the one-to-one chats if it's virtual, or conversations, just like general withdrawance. Difference in personality. Maybe people are a little bit more snappy, a little bit more irked by situations, also tiredness as well. Sleep and mental health are so interlinked. If somebody looks more tired or just looks more exhausted, then just checking in, and if they're not themselves. I think another part of that as well to be really aware of in the workplace is the opposite. So if somebody is not making any mistakes at all, or always getting something done to a very high standard all the time and overworking, that can sometimes also be a sign. And it can be really harder for people, especially when you're overworking, to be vulnerable and to be questioning, are you okay? Because that might feel like we have to prove that we are. So just allowing people time to rest, allowing people time to not be perfect, allowing people to make mistakes, and it's sometimes encouraging that sort of humanness in the work environment as well. So I think there's two sides to it. There's the starting to withdraw and pull back, or maybe doing a lot as well, just to be aware of, which is why I say mostly notice for a change in somebody, or ideally have that conversation beforehand so you know specifically what you're looking for with them.
And we have a bit of a chat prompt here. If there's anyone feels comfortable sharing, what are some of your own early warning signs that other people could notice about you, you know, when you're withdrawing or you're struggling? Yeah, if you feel comfortable to share what that might look like, feel free to pop that into the chat.
And that's really important for other people will then see like the differences in different early warning signs across colleagues. And this is possibly also a good time to practice that vulnerability that we were talking about before. It can feel scary saying that in the chat, but this could be a first step to then having that conversation in our workplace. Oh, that's an interesting point. More dark humor, or more humor in general sometimes is a sign of humor is a really good deflective way of coping with things.
More withdrawn. Perfect.
Yeah, people
And then
talk
I
about
guess, Leanne, in terms of, you know, when we get the question or the response, yes, I'm okay, to an are you okay question, I think that's something that we can all relate to. But, you know, from a Lifeline point of view, you know, often when I answer the phone, someone says, oh, I am all right. And it often takes the prompting and asking again, often twice or three times, for someone to say, no, I'm actually not, I'm really struggling. And, you know, I can't believe I'm calling Lifeline, but I am. And this is what's going on for me today. So it's that moment of, you know, having that human connection, providing that comfort, the space for someone to feel, you know, you sort of do the groundwork, familiarize, you know, yourself, who you are, why you're asking, and then that helps develop that level of comfort. But I guess, what do we do when we get it and we just think that can't be right, or that's not true? What's some advice there, Leanne?
Yeah, and I think that's the same as what you've just said, and what you do all the time in Lifeline is being there for a longer conversation. People often will not say, no, I'm not okay straight away. I think having that chat, developing that interpersonal relationship for a little bit longer, having more time with people, and asking a few times, and a little bit like what you said, explaining why maybe you don't think, or maybe if you don't think they are okay, saying like, oh, okay, I know you say you're okay, but I've noticed that X, Y, Z has been happening recently. So I just want to really check in with you. And it might be that you ask them a few times over a few different situations. It might be that you just leave it in that moment, but it might be a little bit later you'll say again, sort of in conversation, just checking how you are. I know I've said I'm okay a lot of times before when I haven't been, and I've always wanted somebody to, I really wish there was someone who really saw me at that time, so I just wanted to check in and see if I can be that person for you now. Again, sometimes it's about being vulnerable and saying, I often say I'm okay when I'm not, so I want to make sure how you are. Sometimes it's about sort of saying like, okay, like I know you said you're okay a few times, sometimes I found this really helpful, or I spoke to somebody in this service, this team, this thing has been useful for other people, so I'm just going to pop it there just in case. I'm not saying you need it, but I'm just going to pop this there. Or just being with people. And again, I think it's repeating. I think sometimes we can often use the phrase, you know where I am if you need anything, which is such a lovely phrase that comes from such good intent. But when people need something, it's really hard to reach out. So it's inviting people to things. If you're really worried about them, just invite them to more things, or make them aware you're thinking of them, sort of reaching out. One example I think is a really good example of this is Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh. Eeyore was had depression. Eeyore was often didn't want to involve himself and didn't want to do things, but Eeyore was always invited. He'd say no every time. He was always invited. He was always allowed to be as he was. And I think that's a really good example of, even if somebody always says no, just holding them in mind and saying, okay, but if not, we can have this conversation. Yeah, so I just think holding that space for somebody and allowing them to open up if they do, or saying, I'm worried about you, I'm worried about this and this, is there anything I can do? And just continuing to offer that.
And that ties in really nicely with, I think, the notion of boundaries, and then also confidentiality. So people often not saying, you know, no, I'm actually not okay, because they're worried about how that might affect their work and their employment and things like that. But then also for the person asking the question, it's the boundaries and how do we set them? And then also just where to draw a line from both a personal and a professional point of view. But we do all know we're humans and we want to look after each other. We care about our colleagues and our peers. But how can we professionally set some boundaries, you know, when they do approach us for mental health support? What can that look like, Leanne?
I think that's a really, really important conversation that we need to have, and finding that, how do you ask a few times, but then how do you always also look after yourself if somebody does start to open up and does start to tell you something, and you're not quite sure where to go with it, because ultimately we're in a workplace and we are colleagues. So I just think supporting somebody in a workplace environment whilst being aware that it's a workplace environment, and sometimes that might mean somebody does start to open up saying, that sounds really tough, sounds really hard, should we go and find some support together? Let's go and see what's available that's going to support you, because it sounds like you need more than just work support right now. And yeah, I think you're right. Some people don't want to say something because it's a workplace environment. So I think acknowledging that and acknowledging being the reality of how it would affect work, and then how they can still get support outside of work as well, is really important. And it's okay to look after yourself. I am a psychologist. I work in mental health. It's a legal requirement for psychologists to have supervision. So as psychologists, I meet with other psychologists regularly to look after ourselves. It's really normal for psychologists to also have their own therapy. Just because of the nature of what we do, we're not expected to keep everything to ourselves, and it's our job. So you are absolutely not expected to keep everything to yourself, because that's not your job. Your job is in the workplace, it's to support people. You also absolutely are within the rights to support yourself. You don't think a conversation is appropriate to have, it's okay to say, I don't think I'm the person for this, but I really want you to get support from somebody else. And saying, like, I really want you to get the right amount of help, and I think you can get more help somewhere else, is completely okay to say. And also, I think just being aware, like, a workplace doesn't have to be confidential. You can say if you're worried about somebody and if you want to share that concern, you can. You don't have to keep everything to yourself. Even as a psychologist, if I'm worried about someone's safety, so again, this is if we're getting to the darker side of mental health and how it can, if you're worried that somebody might hurt themselves, or if you're worried that someone's in a really bad place and doesn't know how to get out, you do not have to keep that to yourself. As psychologists, if we're worried about somebody's safety, we're worried that they're going to hurt themselves, if we're worried they're going to hurt someone else, we break confidentiality so that they can get support. And we are bound to a confidentiality. But even in that situation, if we're worried for somebody's safety, we will tell them that we're sharing information or with somebody else. And that's someone who's trained in a risk assessment. In the workplace, you don't have that confidentiality clause. You can tell somebody else if you're worried about someone. You do not have to manage everything on your own. And it's okay to say, I'm really worried about you, so I'm going to call next of kin, or say, I think you should go to hospital, speak to your GP, or speak to Lifeline as well. If we're worried about somebody else, we can call Lifeline. So if it's a workplace and you're really concerned about somebody, you are within your rights to call Lifeline, to talk it through, to have a chat, and to see what support's available with them as well. It doesn't just have to be them that got to make that phone call. There's always people there to help everybody. So I think holding those boundaries and confidentiality in mind in a workplace, that if you are worried, you can share your concern with people, and then with people around you as well. You don't have to keep everything to yourself. I think that's really important. Know that you're someone in someone's workplace. You're not someone's therapist, and you don't have to be. You don't have to hold on to everything by yourself, because that's tough on you as well. And you really have to also look after yourself in this situation, and that's completely okay. And also is. So in terms of like a management point of view, like focus on the work, focus on workload and the impact of that, and supporting somebody if they need help outside of work, and finding that balance with them. It's okay to say, I think you need this support outside of work now. I really care about you and I want you to get it, so I think it's going to be more appropriate somewhere else. It's not on you. You don't have to risk assess yourself. You can absolutely ask for support.
Fantastic. And I guess anyone in the chat who's willing to share some of their own ways of looking after mental health, or your own mental health, while you're supporting your peers and your colleagues, what are some of the ways that you put yourself first before you support someone? It's almost like that oxygen mask analogy. You need to help yourself before you help others. So what are some of the ways that you do that? And do you have any thoughts on that, Leanne, around, you know, how people can do that, especially managers, around how they can look after their own mental health and well-being?
Yeah, I think it's a similar thing in terms of knowing yourself, having that time away from work that you can do things that fill your cup. which is so different for so many people. For some people, that's going home and just having time by themselves and having a hot bath and looking after themselves. For some people, that's going out and be socializing with friends or family. For some people, that's walking, but just knowing what fills your cup and knowing what gets your energy. And I just think it's really important as well when we talk about how supporting people's mental health in the workplace and checking in on people. I think it's also important to acknowledge that you don't have to listen to distressing things. As a part of that workplace, you're also a human being, and things might trigger you as well. And you don't have to be in a situation where you're also really struggling. You can say, I can see you're really struggling. I want to help you as much as possible. I don't think I'm the right person to offer you what you need. Let's sit together and find a therapist that might be a good fit, or find someone else you can talk to. I really care about you and want you to have the right support, but that doesn't mean that you have to suddenly manage the mental health of everyone you're working with as well as your own, because that's exhausting. It's okay to check in with somebody and make sure they're okay in the situation, but without taking on lots of things from other people as well. Like, we're also human beings, and things are hard to listen to, and you don't have to. So yeah, I just think really having that, again, work-life balance, knowing what supports you, and there's some wonderful examples coming here in the chat, but yeah, just knowing yourself and what you enjoy, and practicing loads of different things, and just really reflecting on where you're happiest and where you're best, and where you can just have fun. As adults, sometimes we forget to have fun. Work can feel really pressure and life gets hard sometimes, and where, like, we can be childish, we can finish work and go and do something really childish and feel great for it, and that's okay as well.
Absolutely is. And there's a nice note there from, where's it gone now, of someone just saying that to reach out to Lifeline, that EAP often feels too scripted, and if that's the case in your business, and there's been various occasions where I've had someone referred to Lifeline on the phone to me because their employer or their manager suggested it. So it's definitely something that's already in action in the workplace already. I think the last point we had to cover off before we jump into some questions, Leanne, is just around signposting. So that ties in nicely really with the Lifeline notion, but also, there's a number of organizations that are trusted, that are reputable, that we would recommend, that a lot of organizations would recommend someone to go and reach out to if you're concerned about them. But I guess, Leanne, just in terms of this, how do you suggest in a nice way that they do reach out to one of these organizations, or when might be the appropriate time might be to do that?
Again, I think repeating what I think I've just said for an hour is always best. So having these places, having signs that are up in places, having it as part of your intake process, just having some Lifeline or Head to Health or number somewhere, maybe in the bathroom, where people can just jot the number down without anybody seeing that they're doing it. Just having these resources available in multiple different ways, because you don't always know when people need it. If you are worried about somebody, again, you've had the conversation a couple of times, and maybe just saying like, oh, when I struggled, or I know someone where this was really helpful for them, if you do know someone where a service has been helpful, or just saying like, okay, I understand that it's a workplace, however, I just want to make sure that everyone has this information just in case they need it. It might be that you are worried about one person, so share this information with everybody so they don't feel targeted if that's what's needed. It's just a case of sharing out what's available as often as possible, because sometimes we don't know when people need it. Or if we do think they do, then nicely saying, I really care about you and I understand it might be hard to talk right now, but I'm worried about you, and this is some support that's available if you want to access it by yourself or with somebody else. So yeah, I think as many ways as possible, because you don't know how somebody would, when or how somebody would get it. So just sharing it as much as you can, I think, is really important, so people will always know it's there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leanne. We've got a number of organizations or potential signposting resources here on the screen, and we probably have time for one Q&A question, if that's all right with you, Leanne. And just going through, and this one's quite a specific question, but I'd be keen to hear how a positive, supportive workplace could be established in a call center environment. Does anyone have any examples?
Oh, that's a brilliant question and quite specific. If anyone does have any examples of this in the chat, that would be amazing. I think a call center environment, so I've not personally worked in a call center, but I think any environment is important to have those regular check-ins and those chats. So I think it's a similar sort of advice in terms of, if you're regularly checking in with people, do you have times when you're able to talk about life, not just work, and sort of check in with people, really? I think it would be quite similar to other examples that we've given, where you get to know your whole team as whole human beings as well, and create that space where you can have general conversations about what happened at the weekend and what you're doing tonight and what you enjoy, which can then get into conversations of, if someone's moving house and it's really stressful or going through a major life event, that's more likely to come up in those conversations, so then you can check in with them. And I think, again, it goes back to that positive culture. Sometimes it can be hard if you're working in a quite like a competitive environment. And when I think of call center, I think of like sales and that competitiveness, and then it might be harder to admit if you're struggling, if you have a lot of targets to meet. So again, it's creating that culture and being that bravery of how you can be open in a workplace where it's still healthily competitive, but you also support each other as well.
Fantastic. And we had a note just popped in the chat there that management encouraged people working on the phones and in the call center to go outside for a 5-minute breather if we had a difficult call. And I know at Lifeline, we have debriefs with central teams to talk about it, to debrief beginning of a session, and then also at the end when you're logging off and you're going home. It's making sure you don't take any of it home. So that could be done with your peers. It could be done with the support network in the call center. It could be done with your manager on a daily or weekly basis as well.
And I think it's that space to be able to have those moments in a non-planned way as well. When I was working in the emergency centre, the emergency services, we'd have like a room that you could just go in, and it was just a room. No one asked questions. If you went in the room, you could take someone, you could just say, you come into the room, and they just know straight away you can go in and just have a cry or a vent or a whatever you needed at that time. So have a designated space where it's completely normal to just take some time away and then come back when you need it. And sometimes people need that time on their own, sometimes need that time with other people. But it was a space of going, I'm going to room 3, and someone would just know straight away, okay, I'll come with you, because you don't have to say I'm struggling, you don't have to say I'm stressed. It was just, I'm going to room 3, and you'd go. So yeah, having regular check-ins are really important, but also if there's a space where you can just, it's part of the culture that sometimes you have hard conversations, you do something difficult, you just need some time either outside or somewhere to just have a minute, and that be part of the practice of that's also okay.
And it sounds like that ritual was really baked into the culture of the business. You know, people understood that going to that room was essentially a sign that someone was having a moment to themselves and potentially needs support. So that's fantastic. I might wrap things up a little bit here. We've got some resources here on the screen. If you want to stay in touch with Leanne, you can scan the QR code there on the right. And then the QR code on the left is for Unmind specific Are You OK Day resources for current users. So you can go in there, and we've provided recommended courses and content within Unmind that would encourage you to promote across your individual organisations. But I do want to say thank you so much, Leanne. That was a really fantastic session. And I really do think I speak for most people on this webinar that we're all here because we genuinely care about the topic and we really want to help people. But it's often that fear factor, about not knowing how to proceed or the potential to make things worse. So thank you so much for your practical tips and for making this so much more achievable for everyone. We will be sharing the recording and additional resources after the session. We do have a webinar coming up on neurodiversity at work called Great Minds Don't Think Alike. We encourage you all to register. It's on Thursday, 28th of September at the same time as this session today. So yeah, please scan the QR code and we'll be reaching out with registration links anyway. But wishing you all the very best as you prepare for your own Are You OK Day celebrations next week. So thank you so much for joining and have a fantastic afternoon.
And thank you, Leanne, to everybody for being so engaging and vulnerable and open in the chat as well. There's some absolutely brilliant advice coming through and some shared experiences. So yeah, thank you very much for all of your own advice and sharing your own techniques as well.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.